This conference will now be recorded.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. So this is our September 9th, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. Are there any changes to the agenda? Okay, we'll keep it as is. I think Paul's going to bring it up for us. We also have next on here is open to the public for items not related to the agenda. So as everyone on the commission has their cameras on and the public does not, if anyone from the public wants to say anything, you can unmute and or turn your video on and wave, or you can address me in the chat box. I will try. It looks as though that's Michael. I'm not seeing anyone from the public with items not related to the agenda.
I'd like to weigh in.
Okay.
This is Mark Abrams. And I'm hoping that, and I understand you received my proposed statute for preserving long-established neighborhoods in the city. So I just want to check in with that. I'll be waiting for your deliberations going forward. I'm hoping it'll get on the next agenda.
Hi, Mark. This is Paul Connor. I don't recall whether I had, we had communicated last week, and I think it was after I had sent the Planning Commission's packet out, so I'm not sure that I sent your proposal over to them. So I will take care of it prior to the next meeting, but I had already sent out their meeting packet and we communicated last week.
Oh, I must have misunderstood. Okay. Please look forward to that committee. In that case, I'll just give the rough basics. I live on Highland Terrace. I moved there in 1981. Over time, the nature of the street, there were many large and long lots. And then, whereas buyers today can go purchase in mixed design communities, Highland Terrace is becoming a mixed design community, and it's we don't have the option. So I go into some detail about the economic and well-being and other considerations, other impacts of a lot more small houses going in. And there's two projects that are going forward on lots on 116, and apparently they've got clearance to put two houses behind one of the houses, three houses behind the other, and they're fairly small lots. And so I sent my first proposal in to the city in April. It didn't reach the city council for some reason, and been following up since that point. It's getting urgent because the city's, some of the city's trees screening are down behind two of the projects. And my understanding was in the original letter that while they be on city sewer, the five houses would have to be on dug wells. I talked to Mr. Zabolowski in Montpelier a couple months ago. At that point, he had not seen or cleared either of them, but construction in the form of tearing the trees down, which I look out from my office window, my study window, hours a day, are gone. So it's urgent in that sense. And my first request is that construction be halted until my proposal, which is for fairness from the city for long established neighborhoods who experience this as a bait and switch. And we like the empathy and consideration that the DRB says they prioritize for developers. They say we want to provide predictability for developers, which is very good and understandable. But I think the residents, especially paying high taxes for decades and getting very used to a certain quiet, good neighborhood in that sense, deserve at least equal or better consideration in terms of predictability. We had none. So I've detailed it in the paper, and look forward. I hope you can review it as soon as possible after today's meeting, and hopefully get it on next agenda. Thank you very much. I wasn't planning to. I understood that it was in your hands, so I thought, well, I wasn't planning to give the overview right tonight, just to see what the meeting is like. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mark. Well, we will certainly get and review your letter.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else for items not related to the agenda? Okay, then we can move on to announcements. There were a few in our packet. I see Monica did host the mapping sessions. Thank you so much for doing that, Monica.
Yeah, it was very helpful. And we had very low attendance, but I think everyone who left the meetings understood the tool very well and could probably hold their own training sessions with community members, which would be nice.
Are you willing to do it again?
Absolutely. I mean, I've kind of figured a few tricks out in terms of making it easy to compare things. So I'd absolutely be willing to do it. And I hope that when the Planning Commission gets to the point of reviewing such things as Article 12 more clearly, I wouldn't mind even showing you, maybe Duncan, if you agree, what the maps that we set up, because it makes it very easy to compare before and after and extremes. So
yeah, I would second that. I sat through with Monica, and it was very helpful to see the different layers on the maps and be able to compare the different maps when you take one layer on or add a layer off. It was very, very illuminating. So I would highly recommend it to the other commissioners if you want to do it. It was well worth the time.
Yeah, good.
Well, thanks so much, Monica. It sounds like there'd be interest in another session.
yeah, we did it. We did it. Duncan and I did it remotely. I also did it with Vince Bolduc, specifically in regard to the housing housing project. We can do it with everyone using their own computer. So everyone that way is keeping up with and learning the tool by themselves, which was very helpful. So yeah, and on that, I did go through it with Vince with the intention of trying to show him where to look on the map in regard to where it relates to their report to us, so that they can come to us with some more specifics. I was really trying to highlight, look at the map very specifically to give us examples of where you see there's a conflict. And my net takeaway after going through that with him, and this was just my net takeaway, is that their issues in terms of concerns about housing has less to do actually with overall what's happening in Article 12, because it's really not that much of an expansion off of the hazards, as they have issues with some of the underlying zoning that may or may not be worth, or not worth, it's definitely worth, but may or may not be the right time to go through some of that during interim zoning. So happy to talk more about that, but I think Vince is also taking our session back to the working group, and they'll probably be back in touch.
Yeah, thanks so much. Any other announcements? Ted?
I have one item. As you know, there was a tragic accident a little while ago on Route 15 in Jericho. A young gal was hit by a car. I understand she swerved. Her little friend was behind her during the incident. And it brought to my attention, obviously we have a lot of stuff on our plate, but my concern has always been, as a biker, I'm not as much as a zealot as Jessica, who likes to city council meetings at night in all kinds of weather, so I'm not that hardcore. But anyway, Route 15 is a little bit different than Heinsberg Road or Williston Road, but not too dissimilar. And I really think we should, as we build out and as we talk about these developments, keep in mind the implications of that. Just south of us, Nadu Road is going to empty onto Route 116, and the bikers then go from there on 116, presumably. So I really rue the day when a young child gets hit in South Burlington, and I feel like maybe we have not been as diligent as possible to make sure that every possible way is safe for someone to ride. So as we look at these developments, try to think of how a child is going to get from point A to point B if it's not near the bike path. So just food for thought.
Thanks, Tim. Any other connections? Any other announcements or anything from you, Paul? Okay, then.
Yep, just a couple quick things. One is sort of picking up on a piece of what Ted just said. Construction is starting this week of a little missing sidewalk segment at the jug handle over by Spear Street, between Spear Street and East Terrace. So that's been one identified area that was scoped a couple of years ago. Public Works is doing that, of building a little sidewalk section in there. We're working actively on the design pieces. Thumbs up from Sandy. Working actively on the design elements of a sidewalk connection along Airport Parkway from Kirby Road over to Burrard Drive. That's a segment that has no facilities. And also the section of Dorset Street between the Mill Market and Delhi, just south of the Mill Market and Delhi, and Old Crossroads. So those are three that are moving forward this summer. One piece of exciting news, a few months ago, the city submitted a awards nomination for Market Street for the Vermont Planners Association Project of the Year. It won that. And just yesterday, we got the news that the same project, so this is the construction of Market Street, but more importantly, what it represents to City Center, won the Northern New England chapter of the American Planning Association's Project of the Year. So very exciting stuff. So yeah, I think that though I'm going to leave it at that because it's all, that's the peak at the moment.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a technical thing here, Jessica? I'm having a difficult time keeping the call up and looking at the agenda and all the documentation. Can you keep sharing your screen, Paul? I don't know how else to look at the packet and look at everybody. I don't know why I'm having this. Is everyone else in the same boat, or?
I have like 3 screens open. So.
Are you able to do that? See if I can't
No,
do that.
no, it's a good point, Monica. I think a lot, I had the luxury of opening up another screen here just because I have it open for work. But maybe, Paul, as we move into the work session, maybe, Paul, you could kind of walk us through the documents.
I sure can.
Yeah, so I think we're going to get started on the land development regulation overhaul session here. And we had talked about this at the last meeting and asked staff for a few things to kind of help with the conversation, which Paul has provided for us here.
Yeah, so We, at the last meeting, we talked about the different approaches to how development takes place in a planned unit development. You asked us to sharpen our pencils a little bit and give you recommendations for each type. And also, in speaking with Jessica after the last meeting, she asked that we do what we can to help maybe the commission to visualize this a little bit better. And so, as you saw, as I think you saw in the packet, Marla used some basic AutoCAD skills that she has to just kind of sketch up some samples of what those different types could look like. Keep in mind that they were done in a couple hours. This is not the same level as if a developer were to hire a landscape architecture firm to do this. This is really just to try to give you a sense of scale. And as I said in the packet, the actual numbers can be moved around a little bit. So if something seems a little bit too compact, not compact enough, those are all adjustable figures. So where would you like to go, Jessica? Would you like me to walk you through those drawings a little bit, or would you want to just dive straight into the chart that's in front of you and you can go straight into some
It feels like
decision-making?
at least looking at a few of those diagrams would be helpful. I really liked that you started with this aerial photo here and then used this scale as you did the markup ones.
Sure. So let me just walk you through what we were doing here. So we took a neighborhood in the orchards just to give a sense. Last meeting we showed a whole bunch of different blocks. So this is one of those blocks. It's 2,000 feet perimeter. The other drawings in here don't show that aerial photograph in the background because we weren't. You wouldn't typically just sort of drop a PUD right into the middle of an existing neighborhood. If you did do that, that would be the infill type PUD, and that's where some of those really important context sensitive elements would be. And we didn't want to sort of leave with the impression that you just drop twice as many homes into where this is, but it did give us a chance, and we can talk about this later under infill. It gave Sharon, our consultant, and I a chance to think about how you would integrate things and what tools the DRB could be given to make sure that if there was an empty block in the middle, how would you assign things? And we talked about relative widths of lots and things like that. So let me just jump through a couple of these. So we drew these out, a few different examples to sort of show how different forms of density work. So this is 4 units an acre, single family homes, pretty much what you see there. The only difference being that we drew the garages in the back, but this is pretty typical. As I go through Paul Engel's neighborhood, this is pretty much what Eastwood looks like, as well as a lot of the neighborhoods that have been around. Purple in this symbology is single family homes. So this is where we started talking last meeting about what happens when you have the measure is units per acre, but that you allow different types of homes in it. So here we said, well, what would it look like if you still had 4 units an acre, but half of the buildings were duplexes? We drew these duplexes as being sort of the equivalent of like an over-under. One unit is above the other one. But you start to see that the scale starts to change a little bit, even though it's the same number of total homes. And then,
Paul, what's the nominal size of each lot?
In this case, they were about 11,000 square feet each. The blue ones are double that. So that we just took an acre of 43,000 square feet and divided by 4. This isn't a perfect match, but that's how that would be. So this example here would be, if you took those same 4 units an acre and you put it into half fourplexes and half duplexes, and this is what Sharon had been describing previously as you get the same density and you might get a little bit more affordability because you're getting a fourplex instead of a duplex or single family home. But in terms of the feeling of neighborhood, it starts to fall away, and that's where this walkable element becomes challenging if you're going to use a classic block as the standard. This is what would happen. We just sort of played around and said, well, what would happen if we doubled the density? And we said, oh, we'll make it 8 units an acre. So at 8 units an acre, the single family homes would probably share a driveway, so that's what you see there. And the fourplexes sort of, they still wind up being oddly mixed and matched on a lot. And that's, that leaves a lot of space, even though you're hitting the density. So these ones, the next ones here are following the building type density, the second method that we talked about in the PUD. So this is one where the parameters that we set on it were that no more than that there had to be at least 3 housing types being built in this little mini PUD, that they had to be no more than 50% any one kind of housing, and no less than 10% for it to count as a kind of housing. And so what you get here is sort of a mixed block. Typically, you would put the multifamilies at the end of the block. It might be, say, up against closer to a commercial area, that kind of thing. And you get sort of a mix and match of how this could work. We showed it here, an example where everybody had their own driveway. That would be a little bit tight, but we wanted to show an example of how that could take place. This one shows that same arrangement, except we put a few more duplexes in it, and we changed the environment to have narrower lots. And so to do this, there would have to be shared driveways serving this kind of neighborhood. So that would be something that somebody would present to the DRB, and they would talk it through. This is the negotiated part of the PUD. And then this one, same thing again, but this is where the multiplexes become a more significant part of it. And this is how that could look again, just arranging it a little bit differently. So these would all be options for a developer. When I was speaking with Sharon in preparation for this, we were talking about, how PUDs began a long time ago as sort of an ability to create a little bit of flexibility, but with some clear direction to them. And over time, they sort of moved to where we typically have PUDs, which is kind of a waiver authority. And what came in to the world short after that was something kind of like was the beginnings of form-based code that spelled out some specific things. This is sort of the newer environment where it's bringing the best of those two things together. And so the forms are dictated by the building types, but the DRB can still be looking at the context of the environment to determine and negotiate with the developer about what fits well into these environments. So I think that was all of them. Oh, one more here. Again, sort of similar to that last one, with shared driveways and a few more of the fourplexes. So,
Paul? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Continue, and then when you're finished, I'm sorry.
No, I'm done.
Okay, you're saying sense of community, and are you talking about waving to your neighbor from your window, or is there any kind of commonality, common space, a little green space where there's common ground?
Yeah, so I'd say both of those, Ted. So to your second point, in each of the PUD types, if you remember back a long time ago, we had these pie charts that were for each PUD type. And for each one, there's a minimum amount of what's called civic space. So a proper neighborhood park to each of them. And that represents about 10% of the buildable land in each of them. We've also put that same thing into a standard subdivision. So if somebody chose not to be a PUD in the future, you'd have to set aside 10% of the buildable land for a neighborhood park.
Okay.
And then the second part of that about waving to your neighbor, that would be the design elements that would be worked through using the building, the guidelines for the buildings themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as I said, this wouldn't be built just in isolation. An example like this would probably be put into a much larger neighborhood that was being conceived from day one. It's not just being plopped in the middle of the orchards.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying design would be different as opposed to like the Chipman cider mill, the last development they have, every single house is exactly the same.
Right.
This would presumably be different.
Yeah, and those are the pieces that you've got the opportunity to adjust with those building with the building types. So typically in those building types, you'll see that the lots are pretty narrow. And so all the examples that we showed you today, that I just showed you, showed garages either in the back. I didn't show you any that are alley served, but that could be an option. I think that the draft building types would say that if you're building a single family home and you want to have a front facing garage in a neighborhood like this, you could do it, but it would have to be a single car garage. The way that you would get some variety through this is by setting some expectations of different types of buildings and they're being intermixed. And so that's why, for example, here we're showing single families and duplexes. We could also include some standards about variety of designs within that, which we currently do in the Southeast Quadrant.
Good, thank you.
Sandy asked a question of how many buildings are in these multiplexes. So in this example, Sandy, the housing type that's presented as a 3 or 4plex. The design of it would be that it needs to look like a large single family home. So it wouldn't be townhouses. It would be the sort of form of a single family home serving somewhere between 3 and 4 homes in it. And that's one of the building types. For each PUD type, or even in certain areas within a PUD, you would say that you would have single families, 2 families, and maybe 3 to 4plexes allowed in one area. You might say over by a transit area or next to the commercial, you would also allow townhouses. And this is also where we talked last meeting about how you could bring in things like TDRs. So in the right environment, you might allow maybe instead of a maximum of 50% of one type, maybe you could buy up to 60% of that type. Or maybe in certain environments, instead of being limited to single families, 2 families, and 3 or 4plexes, maybe you could put a 5plex in. And that's how you could potentially bring in TDRs in a different approach.
So Paul, if you take this screen that you have right here, and this one is based on building type, not land, right?
Yep.
Okay. So can you just hop back to basically the same setup in terms of the housing mixture, but of the other type? I think it's from the beginning that you showed us, and you talked about neighborhood connection being an issue.
Sure. So let me just make sure I'm on the right one here. So this is.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding what the difference is between this and that first or second slide you showed us.
Okay. So there's one there, and this would be as a building type based one. Here would be the different sort of closest one that we could draw. To that, and you see how, at least if we went with standard lot sizes for each of them, that the lots for the green ones, for the 4plexes, sort of become outscaled to this. Even if you made the lots smaller, which you could theoretically do under today's rules, you'd have these sort of odd open spaces surrounded by certain areas. And this is only if you were to bring it to 8 dwelling units an acre. If you were to bring it at 4 units an acre, which is our current standard, that's the closest we could get to it.
I see. Okay.
So, when we talk about the missing middle, this is part of the problem because we set the number of units as being the priority. And so somebody who's thinking, oh, how can I deliver something a little bit more affordable to the market says, why don't I build a 3 or a 4-plex? But in order to put a 4-plex in, you'd need a full acre today.
So the second one then, this last one that you were showing us, it's basically allowing more density.
Correct. So this would be, if you remember last week, we had a couple of examples. I showed a couple of examples. One was if you made the maximum density in a PUD double the minimum. So this is what that would look like. It starts to approximate that other slide that you asked for a minute ago, but it's still numerically based, and it gets a little bit tricky in terms of here we're assuming there's no natural resources on the property.
But if you go to your last example, I mean, the people that are in these 4-plexes still need more. They need space for more cars. Can you go to your last slide again? Because I'm just like trying to understand, does the 4-plex have enough of its own land?
You mean the 4A or 4?
2C.
Well, the last picture, I can't see my package. The last one this one.
This one here.
So, I mean, I'm kind of looking at those driveways. So I'm just kind of trying to be, feet on the ground here. There's going to be more cars, for example, more kids, more people, more picnic tables associated with these green homes because there's more people in them. It seems like we're reserving a lot less private space for those in this model. Am I reading that correctly? So we're increasing the density, but we're...
Yes, I'd say that that's accurate, but at the same time, and Michael, feel free to jump in just a second, but one, we're assuming that these are all necessarily the same size. They may be 1 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms. We're seeing a 4-plex being built by Habitat for Humanity right now, and they're putting in 7 or 8 parking spaces, but they're not even necessarily expecting that many to be used. And or remember that as Ted had asked a minute ago, this comes with a requirement for park space. And so it becomes a little bit of a different kind of thinking of neighborhoods. Instead of everybody always has a backyard, it gives the opportunity for park space too.
But to that point then, in this kind of scenario, wouldn't we need to require what the size of a unit is? Because what if somebody wanted to fit 4 3-bedroom homes in that somehow? Can we say they can't do that? I mean, can we limit it to say in this kind of structure, you have to limit that 4-plex to 1 bedrooms? We can't do that right now because we don't define the size of a unit, which we've talked about. It seems to me like this works well if we can define the size of a unit.
Well, I think that becomes the responsibility, looking through the characteristics of the building type for a designer to figure out how they're going to meet all those needs. If it does require more parking, then they'll have to be creative and do that. And then that's part of the overall review. I'm just trying to look in the building types that I sent over. I think that there's some discussion about how some of that would be addressed. They're good questions, and happy to follow up with that though. I cut you off, Michael.
Yeah, I'm wondering why we're sort of focusing on parking space. If you look at compare 5A with 2C, I think it was, where the lots for the 4-plexes are quite large. That's space that's not necessarily for parking, but play space, common area. If you've got a fourplex, you're going to have a lot more people requiring recreational space around their homes, and maybe they want to have vegetable gardens, or whatever. It makes sense to have a lot for a fourplex a lot bigger than one for a duplex or a single family.
Yeah, and to that, I agree, Michael. I use parking spaces because I'm looking at the pictures, but I mean, I think particularly after COVID, every single residential unit, period, should have its own private outside space, whether it's an apartment building or on the ground, and yeah, to do with what they want and get fresh, clean air that's 6 feet away from their neighbor. So yeah, if we can limit the number of bedrooms or number of people per unit or something, I don't know how to do that in the other layout where it's building driven, that makes sense to me. And if we can't do that, it seems like it's adding required,
Duncan, you've had your hand up.
Paul, I had a question on the density. When you're looking at that first slide you showed with, was it 16 homes? And the last slide with 50 homes, if we're talking about the same thing, comparing apples to apples, that's a major increase in density, just based on how we're doing this. Is that what we're looking for? Like that okay, take that, and then the last slide, this is theoretically the same parcel, but that's a massive increase in density from 16 homes to 50. I mean, is that, with the building base, is that what our goal is, to get an increase in density in the same parcel? I mean, I understand the variety part, I get, but that's a big increase in density.
Sure. Well, I guess a couple of things. One, keep in mind that this is not in the same physical place. So this is, when we've talked about thresholds, and I think it was in my packet last time, for something to be a full planned unit development, we'd be talking about a minimum of 10 acres so that it can be in its own context. It's not getting thrown up right next to a neighborhood that's been built at 4 units an acre.
Why you say a minimum of 10 acres? Couldn't it be a minimum of 4 acres?
So the proposal that we put forward is that there be a minimum of 4 acres per the commission's request, but that one would be considered an infill PUD, and the priority would be about fitting in with the context of what's next to it. So there'd be standards about, imagine that the block above that had been, was existing homes, that there be a relationship to what exists next to it, so that it's not, as Duncan's describing, just a whole bunch of homes directly across the street. So that's what we were thinking. 4 acres could be the required threshold for an infill. And then at 10 acres, you can really think about your own neighborhood being built. 10 acres of, but to your point, Duncan, it is significantly more. These are some of the radio dials that you all have the opportunity to turn also. So for example, the one that I'm showing you here is 30 units instead of the 16 or so. This
On
one is 40. This is about 4 acres. I think it's like 4.1 acres, something like that. These are some of the radio dials that, if you like this approach, you can adjust and say, we think that anything more than 15% 3 or 4 plexes in a neighborhood like this is just too much. And those are the things that you can, we can adjust if you take this approach. The building type describes it as being one that should be used sparingly in the heart of neighborhoods for 3 and 4 plexes, but that provides an alternative as something to mix up the housing type and give a different family type an opportunity. Monica.
Yeah, thanks. So what I would say to that, though, is you gave the example of 30 versus 16 on 4 acres, but I would remind everybody here that even today, our R4 zoning does not mean it limits it at 16, because there's all kinds of affordable housing density bonuses. I mean, that 16 in today's terms can really be 150% of that in the maximum case, right?
Right, so that would be up to 24 in that case.
Up to 24. So I'm just so to Duncan's concern though, my comment is even how we're doing it today, a block that's R4, it's not limited to 16 if the, and because inclusion, well, separate from inclusionary, if a developer opted to get more by including affordable, they could go to 24. So then we're looking at 30 versus 24, which isn't a huge difference. As long as that 30, like if we go this other route and we're looking at numbers of homes, that whole density bonus piece of it, I think just needs to be figured out. So then are we allowing even additional bonus, or what happens to the affordability, the affordable density bonus? Because that's important.
Yeah, I think something that's hard to picture too is the amount of land that's already been set aside outside of this developed portion. You know, Ted had made the point about the parks, and then, you know, so in a lot of spaces now you can kind of transfer density from one area of the property to another. So your kind of effective density is more what we're talking about here. Like in the spot where we're actually having development happen, like the actual developed piece, you know, what is the effective density versus the, like the, you know, the set asides of the parks and the resources and all those things that we're kind of already kind of outside this little view we're taking right this minute. So,
and that's a great point, Jessica. Just to pick up on that, as in this environment, the natural resources, as you know, are taken off the top. So if you look at today in the way that we measure all of this, you can reallocate the 4 units an acre from wetland areas to other areas, and so you wind up with sort of a mishmash. And I'm going to just give a quick example here, assuming I can get this to work. Hang on 1 second. So I'm just bringing up an example here from Allen Road. So these two large buildings that I'm sure you're familiar with on Allen Road, because of the wetlands / park that is over to the right, this is 4 units an acre. But they're 4-story buildings that, you know, don't really, frankly, in my opinion, don't really match either the Irish Cove neighborhood next door or the unfortunate single-family home that is on a separate parcel pinned between these two. So, you know, that's some of what we see today with the way that density is measured.
So how would this alternate version, what might it have done here? What might have happened here that would be different with this other?
Well, in this instance, let's say there had been a wetland area. So hang on 1 second. Try to get fancy here. So let's say this was a wetland here. So that would be left alone. There might have been a street that went in like this, and then maybe when this was all designed together, might have connected over like this. So you would have had a street there, you would have had a neighborhood being built in here, you would have had, or maybe that would have been the park, and then you might have another street going over like this, connecting over eventually to what's next door here. And you would have had another neighborhood pod there, and you would have probably seen something like what I just showed you there, those 3 and 4 plexes, maybe some townhomes in the right environment, but building out at the same density. On the south side of the same street, we actually, years ago, before John Larkin passed away, he had started to look at a proposal, and the first version of that proposal was exactly the same thing, 2 large buildings. And then we encouraged him to think about some other tools, and what he had come back with was a bunch of 3-plexes that was the exact same number of homes, but in a neighborhood environment.
So we're not really talking about changing density with this. We're talking about where, on the whole, we're talking about where you can build within units that match what's happening close by it and still work with the numbers that you're allowed. We're not necessarily saying, oh, now you get to have more overall density. It's where you can build, you're going to keep it more consistent with what's around it. Right?
If you go with a building type approach, then you're no longer mathematically worrying about density. You can take the approach that's the parcel-based approach that puts a cap on it. In the building type based approach, the caps are the fact that you pulled out the natural resources first, that you said that there has to be a certain amount of park space, and the building types themselves and their individual lot areas that need to be with each one. And so you're not setting a hard cap per se on the number of homes, but you are requiring that it be a neighborhood environment to it. And then you can manipulate, and you could say, you know, maybe the first draft of this has a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet for a single family home. Maybe that's too small. Maybe you want to make it 6,000 in South Burlington or 7,000 in South Burlington. At some point, if you go so high up, then you're not really creating a neighborhood feel, but you can adjust those things. You could say, you know, no more than 10% 3 and 4 plexes, so that you don't wind up with a huge amount of them. Right now, a 4-plex would need to be on 15,000 square feet. Maybe that's the right number. That's sort of the classic number, but maybe it's a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller for South Burlington. That's the way you can manipulate the outcomes without it necessarily being numerically based on the number of homes, because unfortunately today, you know, the historic incentive has been either to build really big buildings like we're seeing here, or to build large single family homes, because you only get X number of units total. So you may as well, you know, sort of like buying a car, you may as well make the bigger one to sell, because you can recoup more of your land costs that way.
So it's the lot size in this is what's really working, is that, you know, per unit size kind of.
Correct. And the lot size then becomes scalable to each building type. So a single family home has a smaller lot than a triplex, but it's not necessarily 1/3 the size. They sort of scale to the shape of what a triplex should have around it. And to your point earlier, and to Michael's point earlier, if a triplex should have a little bit more space in order to have a garden, then that's what you can adjust with it. If, on the other hand, you feel that something closer to a numerical number of 4-6 units an acre is the appropriate number, then I'm excited by this possibility, but this is your decision to make. And if you choose that you want to take an approach that's parcel based, this is your call. We are recommending a parcel based approach for the conservation PUD, and we can talk about that in a little bit.
This is very helpful. I did not understand it this way. That lot size piece that's what helped me, and this visual helped me. So I love this personally for whichever ones you guys recommend, but I love it.
Any other commissioner questions or comments on the parts that Paul's talked about already? Okay, I'm going to see if the public has any questions or comments on the things that Paul was just talking about with the 2 different approaches for density. Looks like Frank, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm not clear on, when we talk about lot sizes or lot configurations, is it the intention, Paul, in a PUD that you would actually define separate lots for these buildings, or is it the type of PUD where there really are no interior lot lines? Can you clarify that?
The classic approach to doing this would be that you would assign lots to them. For a long time in South Burlington, we've had a sort of a very challenging circumstance, and it's common in Vermont, of these footprint lots. where a homeowner, largely through their bank, wants to have an assigned area associated with the lot. And so in order to make that happen, the DRB has allowed for these lot lines to be drawn that get recorded in the land records for ownership purposes, but they don't actually, but the DRB says they don't count for planning and zoning purposes. So we've met with a few developers, and prior to the pandemic and a little bit at the beginning of it, to ask them if we right size the lots themselves, what would their perspectives be? And each of the ones we spoke with indicated that they'd be happy to see actual lot lines for each building, so that there was one building on a lot. A little bit different for a row home, because you'd need to create sort of middle lots. But the idea would be that on the ground, it winds up being the same thing, but it's more clear in terms of ownership. That's not set in stone, but that's the approach that we've taken based on the feedback we've gotten so far.
There are two more points that I'd like to make to the commission as far as the discussion has gone tonight. But can I ask for some clarification? What is a TND and an NCD? I forgot what that stands for.
Sure. A TND is a traditional neighborhood design, traditional neighborhood development, and an NCD is a neighborhood commercial. Basically, a TND would be the kinds of environment that are principally residential, but could allow for some level of commercial, like a South Village would be a really good example of that. An NCD is a more urban environment, like starting to approach something like what is being built around Larkin Terrace. And I'm sort of giving a little bit of extremes there, but that's sort of it's more focused on a mixed-use commercial environment versus a largely residential environment.
Okay, so thank you. And your example of using the Larkin buildings on Allen Road as something that doesn't really fit into the neighborhood context, or the context that was created when that neighborhood to the north got built. And I understand that. Where I live, and my own view of John Larkin's buildings on Allen Road is that I think they're unfortunate. And what really disturbs me about those buildings is that they're so tall. They're at least 4 stories tall, and I believe there's underground parking. If those buildings were 2 stories tall or 3 stories tall, I think it would be a totally different picture on Allen Road. And I'd like to point this out to the commission, that I think that some of the problems that we have with examples of development that some of us may not like, it has a lot to do with the architecture. And that is something that I think deserves some attention from the commission. Because again, those Larkin buildings, if they were lower scale, the idea of and I want to make the case here tonight for multifamily buildings and the importance of having efficient building design, which would include underground parking and interior hallways and things. It's just much more cost effective to build that way. And if the commission and the city wants to preserve some of this notion of affordability that we're all talking about, we can't do it, or we won't get there by building replica large single family homes and things. It's going to be too expensive. Sorry for throwing that out there like that, but that's really what I believe, is that we have to look at some of these efficient building designs. And I'm worried that what I've read in the construction of the PUD regulation so far is that it's going to limit that creativity and flexibility. Thank you.
Okay, Sandy, you've had your hand up. Are you?
Yes. One of the things that we talked about, I think I brought up at the last meeting, was the fact that there's a desire to be developing the housing types that are called the missing middle. There's kinds of housing types that are between the single family and the 4 or 5 story high rise that has, like 32 units or even more. And so that, I believe, as Paul has indicated, that focusing on the building type as opposed to the traditional so many units per acre is more likely to result in a variety of housing types. The housing type, having a variety of housing types is very likely to produce a much broader range of prices of each unit. And we really need housing that it crosses the spectrum of prices in order to address the affordability. And I'm not talking about just the very low income families. I'm talking about middle income families as well. And so I would really encourage you to think positively about the housing, the building type approach. One of the things that the Affordable Housing Committee has, well, it's the big theme in what we've worked on so far has been inclusion, which is also sort of the very first line of our comprehensive plan about having housing that was affordable to households of all types and income levels and everything. And one of the things we've learned is that our city has, so as a result of that, we've taken a look at median incomes by voting districts. And we've sort of become a city of two divisions. The voting district 7-2, which is what AMQ represents, has median income, the median income there is more than 2 times the median income of the other 2 districts. And I think part of that you can see in the housing types. And there's also research that in terms of a community thriving and children growing up and being better able to succeed in work environments, that they need to be able to have had experience and work effectively with people from a diversity of people from different backgrounds and different income levels. So I really think that we need to think about the fact that I think we need to, as a matter of policy and planning, think about whether it might be a good idea to address this situation where we have one part of the city that is very different in terms of socioeconomic status of the families, the households, as opposed to the other 3 voting districts. And I think this is important because to perpetuate what has happened is, in my opinion, not healthy for the city. And employers, go on and on and on about not being able to get people to come here to work because they can't find any housing that they can afford. So that's all I wanted to say. I really like the building type approach.
Great, thank you, Sandy. Lonnie Raven, you had mentioned you have a question?
Yes, thank you for letting me talk. If we go back to the Allen Road development, I just wanted to ask some clarifying questions. I know what was actually built is 2 large buildings where all the density is within those basically apartment buildings, and the rest of the space is open space. Are we saying that that's, I know the buildings themselves, maybe the architecture could be better, but are we saying that we want to change that with the new regulations so that the buildings themselves would have a better design, or that they would be smaller and as a result there would be more buildings and less open space? Or are we saying that large parcel should have fewer units on it, so you could, like, say, have the size of the buildings, have them 2 stories instead of 4 stories, and just have fewer units on that parcel? So I guess this is a question about your intentions and your goals.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I don't know what the rest of you think, but I think it's more a matter of how the chosen density is laid out on a particular parcel. You can still have the efficient use of the land and the same amount of units and maybe a little less open space, but buildings might be smaller, and there may be a few more of them. Instead of 2, there may be 4, but you still have the same density, better design, and you would still have the open space. That's my understanding of what would happen.
So on that parcel, you would prefer to have smaller buildings taking up more space and have less open space, but preserve the overall number of units. You're not trying to lessen the number of units on that parcel. Is that correct?
We're actually having a discussion about whether units is the right way of regulating density, or saying this is the amount of land that's allowed to be developed and it needs to be a mix of housing types, and these are the housing types you can put there. So it's actually the discussion we're having right now, because it kind of feels like in some cases just saying, okay, this is the number of units, you stick them in the space you have available, maybe doesn't really necessarily work for the community. So, Monica, did you?
Well, I guess what I would add to that, because I'm really glad, Lonnie, that you asked your question that way. What was not, Paul, and please clarify if I'm wrong, what was not existing when those buildings were built was this new PUD concept that we're working on, which is going to require set amount of open space in addition to the natural resources. So what we're working to do is ensure that a larger parcel will automatically have open space, more protections of the natural resources. And so we're trying to, therefore, since we're really demanding more of that, we're trying to find ways to allow what is developed to be as efficient as possible and still work within what it's next to. I think is that.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I'd just add to that is that areas that are unbuilt is not necessarily the same thing as quality open space. So looking around, not to continue to pick on those 2 buildings on Allen Road, and I apologize if anybody lives there or has friends who lives there, but that's not, most of the space around there is not really usable space. It's not a space that people feel that is their own backyard. It's not delineated to be a common area that can create an environment where kids would play baseball. So it's green, but it's not functional. And so part of the focus of the PUD, and similar but at a different scale than the work we did in City Center with the form-based code, is let's focus on quality spaces. And so as Monica said, there would be a minimum requirement for parks, and those would have certain standards associated with them, specifically locational standards about where they fit into a neighborhood. And then each building would have with it the appropriate scale to its own little backyard, but not necessarily assuming that we're doing 3/4 of an acre for everybody, because that's that's what's eating up the land, frankly. And some of what the commission wanted to achieve with this project from the beginning is looking at those 6 or 7 acre parcels and seeing 9 homes being placed on them. And it's a big backyard, but it's 6 or 7 acres of South Burlington land that won't ever be built into something else.
It's clear from this PUD project that we're doing that we are looking for efficient use of space as well as an aesthetic layout and a layout that would enhance the quality of life of those who live there.
Duncan?
Yeah, Paul, I think the drawing, the little sketch drawing, that fine art that you did, was actually very illustrative of what could have happened if we had had the PUD in place, as opposed to what did happen with the current regulations. And I think, Monica, you mentioned it, that would have fit much better with what was around there versus what was built. And I think it's the context of how that works, how that space works with the ones around it. And there would still be a lot of open space there.
And, I think, just to follow up, I think maybe on what Frank was saying, there is a place for large buildings. I mean, if you look, I know we didn't have that on the small little example that Paul was giving us as the kind of to define the two different ways of calculating how density's allocated. But, in the bigger chart that was down further in our packet, there are larger buildings as building types for us to assign to locations. So it's not like that type of building is totally removed from future city locations, right? Is that?
And yeah, and I would encourage commissioners, if you haven't taken a trip through South Village recently, the South Village includes some 8 and 10 unit buildings in them, and they're built, especially the ones at the very south end of the property. Each unit has its own front door, even though they're 10-plex. It's not exactly what Frank was speaking about, but it is an example of a larger scale building that can fit into the context. The city's regulations today limit the in a district like that, the R4 district, to 4 units in a building, so that would not be able to be built today. The reason the commission had moved away from that was that there was a sense that you didn't have the controls in place to make sure that it fit in properly to a neighborhood. So in that case, it did, because David Schroyer had a vision associated with it. But I think, Jessica, I think you were on the commission, and maybe Ted was on the commission. Back when Kirby Cottages were built, some of the feedback that the city was given at the time, after the whole thing was approved, so it wasn't a threat, the developer noted to us that it could have been built, instead of as 7 cottages, it could have been built as a 7-plex, just sort of popped right into the middle of Kirby, that neighborhood, and that wouldn't have been the right environment surrounded by what it was. The commission's decision at the time was, we need to move towards a project that thinks better about context sensitivity, but in the meantime, let's limit it to 4 units in a building so that we don't get something extreme before we thought it through. So
I think it might be time to return to that first page, that table you had, Paul, about the recommendations for the density type or density approach.
I have 2 questions and a request.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Monica.
Okay, so Paul, just so I understand, if we go to building type, how does that connect with the density bonus?
in terms of inclusionary?
Yeah.
That kind of thing?
Not inclusionary. No, not inclusionary. The density bonus.
For density bonus for what purpose? I guess that's where
I'm sorry, affordable housing density bonus, because we still have the density bonus everywhere, and it's based on that. Yeah.
Well, the way that would get addressed in an environment like this is, A, you could choose to move towards expanding inclusionary, as you've done in certain areas of the city, and you could say, as part of this kind of traditional neighborhood development, there's an inclusionary requirement, and the offset is that we're no longer counting density as a mathematical number. That's how it was done in city centers. So that's one approach. Another approach could be that you could distinguish, we talked about a minimum of 3 housing types. You could distinguish affordable housing, even if it's the same exact building, as being a different type. So you could incentivize it that way. So you could say that a single family home that meets a certain affordability criteria counts as a type. So that's something that somebody could do. We had talked originally at the very beginning of this about putting in a point structure into it, something where you would need to get X number of X number of points to get your PUD approved. So, you get your whole thing done, and then you need to get 10 sort of South Burlington points. And that might be a higher level of energy efficiency. It might be more affordability. It might be some other criteria. That's still a way that you could go. Working with the consultants, we felt that for this first edition of it, that we didn't want to overload it with so many bells and whistles that it becomes so complex that people don't understand it. But that is a way that it could be addressed by having people reach upwards.
So just so that, I think to be fair though, we need to recognize that the moment we say, let's assign building type to this PUD, we have voided the current affordable housing density bonus component of the LDRs. So we would at least, I think, need to give the Affordable Housing Committee the opportunity to present us with perhaps an addendum to that section 14. Because maybe there are some very simple solutions that we can put in there, but if we don't put them in there at the same time that we introduce this, there's going to be neighborhoods that have zero affordability incentive, and that doesn't seem right to me. So Sandy's on the call, Vince is on the call. Just if there's, I think it can be a quick fix, but please let's not let that get lost, because we don't have inclusionary everywhere right now, and it will mathematically be removing the ability to have a density bonus. Okay.
I'd say that's a great point, Monica. I would also point to, other than multifamily buildings, the only one that's taken advantage of the current affordable housing bonus was Kirby Cottages in the last 15 years. And so,
right.
You know, the tool is a tool that's out there. It's not really getting used very much.
Right. I don't think it would
so
slow
room for improvement is all I mean to say.
Yeah, I don't put it out there to slow down the PUD process, but while we're working out the PUD process, I'd at least ask that we give the Affordable Housing Committee an opportunity to offer some language that might be a sidecar to this. And then my second question was going back to that fourplex on the shared lot, with the lot lines that you're saying would in the building types would be. So if those are not rentals, if they are for purchase, is someone purchasing a component, will they have deeded private space that is theirs, an outdoor patio? Is there some kind of deeded private outdoor space, even if the overall lot is shared, or does that have to be subdivided? Like, how does that work?
So under Vermont law, the form of ownership is not something that we have, that municipalities have authority over. Typically, if you're talking about something like row homes, townhomes, like over on the east end of Market Street, then this would be arranged so that the individual owns the space in front and behind each unit. There could be an arrangement where if everybody had space on the ground floor that they have land associated with it. But there may also be an environment where somebody chooses to build a threeplex, let's say, or a fourplex where it's 2 units below and 2 units above, and that would be a condominium ownership. So it would be a little mini association owns the building in and of itself, and they would operate as a unit together.
So that would be up to the developer. It's not something that we can regulate. It would be up to the, it just seems like, especially if we're moving towards trying to get people to build 3 and 4plexes that look like one big house.
Right. Well, the way in which you would address it is, let's take a duplex as an example. So there's 2 different kinds of duplexes that could exist. One is side by side and one is over under. Side by side, the individuals would likely own their own space. Over under, it would be a shared space between them, because you wouldn't want to give it all to the to the ground floor one, and that would be up to the developer, assuming that both types are allowed. You would set the parameters of something like that, and then they would create the they would use the tools made available to them.
So then lastly, sorry to be hogging time, but my request is, and I'm going to keep on saying it every meeting because I don't know where it's going to fit in, I would like to request that every single residential unit built from here on out has guaranteed outdoor private space. I don't care if it's an apartment or a huge house. I don't care if it's a balcony off of a second floor, but I think every residential unit should have guaranteed outdoor private space big enough for a chair and a garden, raised bed. And that could happen in a larger home that's 3 apartments with balconies on different levels, as long as we have the regulation. Everyone should be able to have private outdoor space in Vermont. Thank you.
Agreed.
My question is, does it have to be private or can it be shared, that outdoor space? As long as there's access to fresh air and light, I don't know if it has to be private.
Well, maybe the idea seems good. Maybe that's something we can come back to how it's worded. And I don't know, Frank and Vince, could you turn your video off until you're trying to get my attention? It's easier for me to be able to focus on waving if there's less video. If you're trying to get my attention, you can turn it back on. Paul?
Also, Vince, I can take care of that for you if you like. Just a moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so you want to go back to the chart, correct?
Yes, please.
All right.
The chart.
The table, the table is what I meant.
What page are we on here?
This was page 5 of the packet.
Yeah, okay.
So this in one chart tries to lay out our staff's recommendations for you to consider. And within these recommendations, there's some options. And as I said before, there's a lot of radio dials. Once you pick the direction that you want to go in, then we can help. We can have Sharon help us to show you how those radio dials can adjust for the things you've talked about tonight. But she's at a little bit of a standstill in terms of approach, because this is sort of the next really key decision to go towards. So I'm happy to walk through any of this or answer any questions, but I'll let you all look at it first.
My question is the bottom right-hand corner, say, determine whether to include or exclude hazards and density calculations. I guess I need a little bit more explanation of that.
Sure. So in a conservation PUD, so this is very different from the other types. So in a conservation PUD, what a developer would be responsible for doing is to set aside 70% of the land. I asked Sharon whether typically that's 70% of the buildable land, i.e. after hazards and after level 1 resources, or if it's 70% of the entire. She said that it's typically measured as 70% of the entire land, but of course, if your floodplain is 90% of the land, we're not going to let you build on a bunch of floodplains. So it's more assembling land up to 70% of the most important natural resources to be conserved. If it happens to be a hazard, then that takes up more than 70%, then it would go over your 70%. You could choose to base it on sorry, there's 2 things. One, I was speaking about land area, and then 2, your specific question, Ted, was about density. So I was just speaking about land area and how you would typically measure how much of the land is buildable, 30% versus 70%. Then the question is about whether you calculate density on the entirety of the property. The argument for including, if you chose to include hazards in your density calculation, then what you would do is you'd say, I have a 10-acre parcel, and it's the underlying zoning district is 4 units an acre, so that's 40 units. And those 40 units could be put on the remaining 30% of the property, assuming that the building, the building, the number of units in a building that you allow in that district carries it. So it'd be 40 units in the 3 acres buildable.
However,
the argument in favor of doing it that way is that that's a very clear link to the current rules, and anybody who makes the claim that there's a takings being done, you can say, well, you were able to do 40 units before, you can do 40 units now, it's just on a smaller footprint. The argument in favor of excluding density, the hazards from density, is that it probably right sizes the scale of the remaining 30% a little better. And, you know, an argument that could be made that I know you've shared in the past is that wasn't buildable to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 2 approaches. We have received a little bit of feedback just before this pandemic hit us that perhaps the answer lies somewhere between them, where a hazard gets credit, but it's not full credit. Maybe it's 15, you know, it counts for 10% or 50% of its scale, and that way you're acknowledging its existence. So those are the options that exist there.
are you compelled, I mean, when you suddenly have that kind of density, and I would assume the hazards are more probably in the southeast quadrant than they are in the inner city of South Burlington, but wouldn't you be compelled to have, you know, Russian type housing as we find on Allen Road?
I need to think about that Russian type housing question.
4 units, you know, or 4 stories, let's say. I mean, you really have to pack them in order to get those units on 3 acres.
Right. So you could choose to limit the amount of development as you currently do by saying that the most you can do is a 4-plex as the underlying in a conservation PUD. Or you'd go with the underlying zoning district typically, so that if your conservation PUD were in a neighborhood that was 4 units in a building like the R4 is today, then that's what you'd max out at. So that could bring back yeah, so that's one way that you could limit it, but you also raise a possible outcome if you don't have a maximum number of units in the building to having something like Allen Road in that circumstance.
But don't we have to make sure the math works for people? I mean, if we say, sure, you can have all this density, but you can't, these are the sizes. I mean, maybe the only way to conserve certain parcels of land that are important is to, you know, allow an entire development to be that in certain cases. Like, how do you
well, and we can
density,
and we can have this, right? We can also have the city attorney come and have a conversation or give you a letter a little bit more on the takings issue. But to the flip of what you're saying, Monica, take the extreme. If a property was 98% floodplains, there's no expectation from the owner of that property. There's no financial expectation that they should have been given. They should have been able to assume that they could have built on the entire thing.
So then the corollary to that, Paul, is can we do this just based on the type of hazards? For example, you know, you did mention, you know, like a floodplain. Well, that's, you know, a pretty high degree of hazard, whereas, you know, we're talking about adding some, and I'll call them hazards at this point, like, you know, forest blocks, you know, so, you know, maybe, you know, you don't allow for the increased density, you know, if it's a floodplain, but maybe you do allow for some increased density if it's some of the newer stuff we're looking at doing.
Yeah, and I think, Bernie, that's exactly what Sharon had been talking about as the approach to think about here, that hazards classically are the things that are recognized around the country as no-build areas, not by policy, but by, I mean, they are policy ultimately, but by safety and overall nationally recognized wetlands, floodplains, certain extreme steep slopes, that kind of thing, distinguished from high priority policy actions like maybe the forest blocks. And that's where this could be distinguished, and saying that one gets credit, one doesn't, or one gets partial credit and one gets full credit.
Yep.
And that's what sort of where we were angling towards for your next meeting, if you chose this approach to really hone in on exactly that question.
Yep. And I'm on board with heading that direction.
Me too.
I think that's a great idea, Bernie. That seems like a very equitable way to do it.
Yep.
Okay, so it sounds like that kind of newly configured land-based option makes a lot of sense for the conservation area. And then staff's recommending the building type based for the other 3 types listed here. Does anybody have any feedback on that? Or question?
Yeah, sorry, I do have one question, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. So effectively, how do, I don't want to, I guess I'm using the term maximum density. With the building type, how do you achieve, what is the maximum density? I mean, how is that somehow figured out? Is it?
So the maximum density becomes an output of your design. And I know that it took me a while to wrap my head around this question, but if both as established by the rules and as worked on through the design in front of the development review board, the ways that you would limit development, for lack of a better word, or limit density, is you would say, what is the size of the lot associated with single family homes, 2-family homes, the various different types. And so that will create one element of it. The second element of it becomes how much of each of those you can do. So if you said that a neighborhood had to be at least 80% single family homes, that's going to be less dense than one that is 40% or 20%. So you can manipulate those things at the planning commission level if you like, and then ultimately this is where the developer would also have some choices that they need to make. In my examples, I showed you the most compact one has shared driveways, for instance, or might only have 1-car garages, which is not very popular today, but does exist in some of our neighborhood, like Hayes Avenue. That's how the homes were built, because that's what the target market that they had. And so, some choices would have to be made by a developer about who's their market. So they might get a little bit more density if they went with smaller lots, but they might only be able to have a smaller home on a smaller footprint, which meets a different audience. The final numbers, we can run some scenarios of what the final numbers are, but they're hard to pin down as an exact one. Sharon has a spreadsheet that I'm happy to share with you of about 11 different scenarios as to how it could work out, but it depends on the choices that you make of where you place your open space, of how you want to, do you want to have an alley served neighborhood, which is a very different feel, gets you a little bit more density, but then it also has some additional infrastructure with it. We can help you, as I showed in those images, to sort of give you what we think of the outer boundaries of this, but it's really intended to be malleable to meet different product that an applicant would want to focus on. And what you wind up focusing on is the neighborhood scale, the amount of open space in parks, the natural resources that you choose, and then all the other stuff that we talked about a little bit at the last meeting of street types and making sure that you've got a neighborhood scale street so you don't have Nolan Farm Road running right in front of your house, that you've got the scale of the buildings.
Okay.
Well, and Paul, some of it is going to be context based as well. If you take a T&D, for example, well, if it's a T&D that's closer into, you know, the main heart of the city, where you're adjacent to, you know, existing subdivisions, say, it may have a different look to it and a different kind of density feel to it than if you're out, you know, Dorset Street somewhere. So
Right.
there's a certain amount of context to it. And I think, you know, we want to, you know, I think one of the things, at least I'd like to see, or that we want to do, is we really want to encourage density on, you know, the main transportation routes where there's, you know, bus stops and you're close to shopping and it's walkable and, you know, all those other things. I mean, that's where, you know, we really want to see maybe, you know, some of the more percentage of multiplexes. Whereas if you go out a ways a little bit where you're not quite on those, you know, main transportation corridors, you know, you might not want to, you might have a higher percentage of single family in a case like that.
Yeah, and you know, Bernie, that's what I was thinking about earlier and wasn't sure exactly how we'll parse that out. You know, in the big table, it just lists for a lot of the different building types that it's appropriate in certain types of PUDs, but like how do we maybe figure that out a little more clearly, like you just said?
Sure. So a couple of ways that you could do it, and I know that there's some hands up, but just to so that we don't lose the thread of that. In terms of context, one of the things that can be looked at, say on the edges of a PUD or in an infill PUD, is looking at some of the relationship elements to what's immediately next to it. So we gave the example earlier of a lot width. So if, you know, the neighborhood next door has an average of 130 foot wide lot widths, then maybe what you'd say is that it needs to be the average between what the neighboring lots are and what a typical would be in this in a TND, and you wind up with like a 90 foot wide lot, which is sort of transitional. In terms of the question of how do you apply it differently in different areas, you could, for instance, apply a standard that says that when you're within X distance of a fixed transit route, that certain standards apply, either bonuses or, you know, the inverse of that, of fewer things that are further away from transit.
Well, your suggestion of 8.
Wait, whose turn is it?
I was trying to call on Duncan before, but then I got muted.
I'll take my turn. So I get, Paul, to build on what you were just saying. So the expectation is that we would be looking at different percentages within the same type of PUD, like traditional neighborhood, as Bernie was saying, closer to a transit overlay district, we're going to give a higher percentage of multifamily, and further away, we're going to give a smaller percentage of multifamily.
It might be percentages, or it might be a type that opens up. You know, Frank was speaking earlier about some larger buildings. One example that I have seen is that when you're within a quarter mile of a transit route, the option opens up for an 8-plex to be put in there, or a 12-plex or something like that. Whereas if you're further back from that, then it's no longer that. So you could either adjust the percentages or the types. The types is a little bit easier because the percentages can be calculated over the entire PUD typically. So it allows the developer to think about how they want to arrange things, but we can follow up on both of those.
Michael?
Yeah, we are looking for density on the transit routes or in the transit overlay district. So it makes sense what Paul has written there, that increase the minimum where it's zone 4, we could increase it to 8 units per buildable acre if it's within a quarter mile of a transit route. I think that's a workable idea, irrespective of what type of building, just general density.
Okay, Monica, and your.
So can I just make the comment that single family homes are expensive, and that's what drives a division in communities. And I would ask that we as a commission rethink exactly that the areas that are farther out and whatever else, maybe it's to type. Maybe if there's going to be a 3 or 4 plex, it needs to look like a mansion so that it looks pretty like the other single family houses. But I would ask that we do exact opposite. And we should always be encouraging a diverse, remember that single family homes are very difficult for people to buy. We can make 3 and 4 family, multi-homes look beautiful, and maybe that's what it should be. It's the single family can be very, very expensive unless we're limiting the size of it, which we're not talking about doing now. So when I heard what was just said before, because I'm getting it, that the farther out, the farther from transit, I understand, but I think we have an obligation to provide, even in those farther out away from, the subway, the bus lines, we have an obligation to provide affordable buildings there too that can be beautiful. Big house that has 3 doors.
Well, but we are in a sense, Monica, because we're requiring different percentages. So even in the outlying, we're going to have a certain percent that's going to be, multi. And I think, we haven't arrived yet on what we want those percentages to be. So it's certainly a discussion to have, but I don't think we're totally eliminating any type in any area at this point. At least I don't feel like we are.
Right, and I appreciate that. I totally agree. I just wouldn't I would ask that we be open to a mindset that doesn't necessarily say that a single family home is ever the majority. I mean, it's more about so just putting that out there.
Ted, do you have your hand up, or are you?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't. Nope, thank you.
Got it. Okay. I guess any other feedback from the commission on these ideas? It sounds like we got quite a bit of feedback. Michael, go ahead.
There was a discussion at our last meeting about the conservation PUD, where a landowner has a sizable parcel but doesn't want to be forced into a minimum 4 units per acre of 4 units per buildable acre. I think it was Noah Hyman who has a large parcel. And there was a discussion, and I think it was Paul suggested that maybe a possibility would be that there be a clear distinction made from an applicant as to which path they want to go down, either a large lot or a minimum density, and it'd be up to the owner of the land or the developer which way to go. So
thanks for bringing that up, Michael. And I in the bottom left-hand corner, this is really just a throwing spaghetti at the wall, but looking at how to achieve that in a way that achieves something of what Noah was speaking about, and assuring that it's not being used as sort of a loophole to just do a development of large lots. And so a couple of thoughts that we had were possibly something like that could be allowed if there was either a maximum number of these large lots, or maybe they agreed to conserve even more of the total land, or maybe there's a maximum buildable area assigned to it, so you don't wind up with 35 acres of 2-acre homes, which doesn't seem to, that's not what Noah was speaking about, but how to really incentivize the best example of what he was giving. So just a couple of thoughts, but we're very open to other ways to do that too.
Yeah, well, I think in his case he was talking about four homes for his 4 children, and that's it, a family compound, so to speak. And I think his lot is more than 30 acres, so he would have maybe a conserved part of 29 acres and 4 1-acre parcels for his children. It would be subdivision.
Right, so that would be an example of that 85% is conserved and the rest they could choose to do as they wanted, something like that. I don't know if that's the right number, but along those lines.
Yeah, it could be 85%, it could be 80%. It depends on what they want to do, you know. But
yeah, we started thinking about, you know, what does the 70% represent? And for, say, a 40-acre parcel, 70% still leaves a pretty good, 30% is still a pretty good chunk of land. And to see that all be large lots felt a little bit high. And so that's why we're thinking about something closer to 80, 90, somewhere like that. But
yeah, well, it might not fit all. In his case, 85% probably would work, but not necessarily for somebody who only has 25 acres and wants to do something similar. Or I want to buy 25 acres, but I want to conserve all but 4 acres. And the 4 acres, you know, in order to finance in part the purchase of the land, then those 4 1-acre lots, I could sell them, but I will have conserved 21 acres out of 25.
But they would also have the right, a family would also have a right to subdivide to resolve that, right? They could subdivide a portion of their land to give X number of acres to a family member, whatever. I mean, they have other means, I think, outside of this through subdividing, right? It certainly seems fair that a family would have that ability.
But I think what he was saying, he could subdivide, but then he doesn't want to be forced to put 4 units on each of the 1-acre lots, because he wants to give each of the 1-acre lots to each of his children.
So
I have some. I mean, I wonder whether it's whether we can legally force a landowner to commit to conserve, say, 85% of the land for the privilege of not being required to build more than they want.
I think that's a good point. And, you know, I think, Paul, just the general idea of the minimum density too might be good to just make sure that's acceptable. Paul Engels, we haven't heard much from you tonight. Do you have any questions, or is this seeming reasonable? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I also want to make sure you're.
I'm doing fine. I'm just listening. I don't really have anything to say.
Very good. I know we just had a bunch of back and forth.
Sure, that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. So I do have somebody's hand up in the chat box from the public, so I'm going to give a little bit of time for some public comment. Lonnie Raven, you would go ahead.
Yeah, when I was thinking about Monica's comment about not only having expensive single-family houses in the outskirts that are not on the transit overlay to preserve more diversity, even though that you can easily imagine that would be the more expensive neighborhood. There are places there are cities, and I think Burlington is one of them, where they've sort of blanket given the opportunity for any single-family unit home on one lot to build an accessory dwelling unit. So that would be a way to diversify housing in a specific neighborhood by giving that by right to any single family parcel to let them build a second or a third unit if the parcels are large. So I'm just putting it out there. I think Minneapolis tried that, and Burlington is pushing that through. So I just wanted to give that comment because it's also, I've lived in South Burlington for many years, and there are definitely more expensive neighborhoods and less expensive neighborhoods. And while you want the transit to be available to the people who have less money, that does mean that the rich people live on the outskirts where there's no transit, and the poorer people live closer to town where there is a bus line. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lonnie. Any other public comment or commissioner? Oh, Sandy, you got your hand up? You're muted. Sandy.
Okay.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The point I want to make is that when we're talking about 80% of the area median income, or even if you're talking about more middle income households, that would, I think the median is in the 60,000s, 60,000 in South Burlington. These are households that can afford a car. And they do not have to have a transit line. So when we're talking about a variety of housing types for a range of prices for each unit, we need to remember that these people are able, and actually, given where they probably live, must have a car. So I think this idea that affordability has to be only on a transit route, especially if you're talking about in the 80, 100, 110, 120 of area median income, it just doesn't mesh with reality. So I really would appreciate people taking that to heart.
Okay. Vince, did you have something? I think I saw. And if you do, you are muted right now. Okay, maybe not. So Vince, if you do want to say something, you can speak up. Otherwise, it looks like Frank, you just turned your mic on.
I did. Thank you.
Yeah.
Paul, you'll just save me a lot of hunting. If you can tell me, where are the current PUD regs?
When you say current, do you mean those currently legally adopted or the latest draft of what the commission's looking at?
The ones that are current legally adopted. Yeah.
They're right on our website under, if you go to the Planning and Zoning Department, you go to rules and I think it's called regulations and comprehensive plan or something like that. It's okay. Article 15 of the land development regulations.
Oh, Article 15, thank you.
Yeah, so it's all currently meshed in with subdivision. It's all sort of blended together.
Thank you. What is the current minimum size for a PUD in the city though? Is it
in the R4 district and the R2 district, I think it is, it's a minimum of 2 acres. Otherwise, there is no specific minimum.
Okay.
As I said at the last meeting, PUDs have sort of evolved in South Burlington to function largely as a waiver tool in a lot of ways. And so they've operated for, a single building on its own lot so that somebody could get a setback waiver for a lot of historical reasons that can be managed much more simply under current state law than our rules have historically dealt with it. And that's one of the things that we were hoping to untangle in this project, to make it easier to just do that, say that setback waiver as a waiver, rather than having to be an entire PUD and then the DRB is sort of wrestling with, is this really a planned unit development or is it a building that wants to be 2 feet closer to the property line?
I appreciate that. What I've gotten out of tonight's presentation is that, I'd like to take the opportunity to address some, specific technical points, and I, rather than try to do this extemporaneously in front of you tonight, I'd like to offer something in writing this week. I'll try to put a memo together to put in front of all of you commissioners and highlight some of the issues where I see some problems from a development standpoint. So I will provide that to you, and this way you'll have time to digest it, and it'll give me time to actually present it so that I know it connects well with the existing regulations and what's being proposed. I'm just hoping that that'll be something you'll find some time to take a look at.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Just Frank, is it specific to this assignment of density, like this table we're looking at here?
It is to some extent. I guess maybe if I put out some of my ideas and some of my questions, then maybe that'll trigger some thought on your part, because I'm not really sure. I mean, you've done a lot of work on this, and it's coming out to me at least, you know, is for first review right now. So if I react to something and I don't interpret it correctly, then if you correct me, then I'll understand that you had a different idea in mind. It just seems like a very complex package, but I know your intention is to try to clarify this so that people can use it more easily in the future.
Yeah. Okay, and that sounds great. Paul, how do you think is best to proceed? I know we're getting close to 9 here. I know there was some feedback you really wanted to get to be able to help Sharon move forward. Where do you think we're at with that? I know we had a whole nother piece we were going to look at too.
Right. Well, I guess understanding the specific questions that came up this evening about the specific building types, or Michael's question and comment about the conservation areas, I guess the feedback that I'd love to get as soon as you're ready for it is this generally the right approach, where the infill, the TND, and the NCD go with a building type based approach. The conservation goes with something that is more directly tied to the current, to the underlying zoning district, and then is building, you know, on the remainder of the land. And that, yeah, I guess that's the feedback. As soon as you're ready, that's really the what's the word I'm looking for? The engineering term of critical path. That's the critical path question for us.
So I'm okay with the overall approach as you've presented.
I have a question about how we can make sure, even on a conservation PUD, that density can be appropriately maximized safely. If land-based is the best way to do that, I agree. And it sounds like maybe it was. But would it also mean that when would we decide if we should allow, even in a conservation PUD, that all buildings be 4-story, densely built? I guess I missed when we have that conversation.
Right. So classically, Monica, that would be tied to the underlying zoning district. So if it was a conservation PUD in a R4 district, which has a maximum of 4 units in a building, then it would be 4 units in a building. If it was a conservation PUD that happened to be, you know, in a higher density district for whatever reason, then it might be a larger building. But that's when you would have that conversation, is once you're selecting where these, you know, once we tie it all together, we'll show a map of where these things are applicable. And then if you want to manipulate building, not building types, but units in a building, that's where you could do that.
Duncan?
Paul, you know, you gave us the recommendations here, and I agree overall that if the building type base could be good. Is there any way you can put some more meat on the bones of that and give it some more definition in terms of percentages or stuff, just to give us a better example?
Yes, so, we do have that. That goes back to those pie charts for you. I'm happy to send those over to you as to how that would work. And I guess in terms of specifically the percentages of saying, you know, is it no more than 50%? Is it 3? Those are the things that they can be adjusted. But in terms of Sharon figuring out where to put her time, she needs to know that that's the path we want to go down. Otherwise, she's sort of spinning her wheels on figuring out all that math for you.
I guess, would she have any recommendations on the percentages for these different things, or?
Yes, I can pull up. So the percentages, there's 2 percentages that come in. One is how much land is residential versus, say, open space. And then the second one is the building types. Typically, she would say that in a full-size TND, you'd want to have at least 3 different types of housing. And the classic ones that come out of sort of the smart code would say no more than 50% of any one type of housing. As you get down to the smaller ones that are, say, between 4 and 10 acres, you'd probably only have 2 housing types required, because it starts to get tricky to fit these things in. Mm-hmm. And what you decide as a housing type is sort of up to you. We gave you the examples in there of single family, 2-family, small multiplex, medium multiplex. You could decide that a side-by-side duplex is a different type from an over-under duplex. Or you could decide that a single family home less than 1,200 square feet is a different type than a single family more than 1,200 square feet, so as to encourage that kind of variety in a different way. So really this is, I sometimes get a little bit overwhelmed by all the different options that exist here. And it's not my intent to share that back to you all, but it is really, those are all things that you can manipulate to the comfort level of what you want to accomplish out of all this.
So Duncan, does that make you more comfortable knowing that those percentages can be kind of adjusted if we did go forward with the building type?
Yeah, I guess what I was looking for is kind of a marker or a starter, and then we can say, okay, let's tweak here, tweak there, somewhere to start.
And we do have that, Duncan. That was a very long time ago that was sort of thrown out there, but it was before any of us, including staff, had really kind of honed in on it. So we can bring that back. That my hope was to start to talk specifically at the next meetings, in the next 2 meetings, about how to marry the environmental standards with this, which was your first meeting in August, and then where you would want these PUD types and how you want to adjust those radio dials from an initial one, as you just described, to calibrate to South Burlington.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah, I had a question about whether we are, and maybe Frank can comment on whether we are being overly prescriptive in trying to define what percentages of what type of buildings can be built in a particular PUD. It might be 50% duplexes and 50% triplexes, but the developer or the owner of the land may say, no, I want to do all duplexes. I want to do my property I can build 8 duplexes on a little what do you call it, close. And I don't want to be told that I have to build half triplexes and half duplexes. I want to do all duplexes. How are we going to reconcile that with being as prescriptive as I think we are?
Is that a question that you wanted to ask me, Michael, or that you were throwing out to the commission?
I think it's something we have to think about. And maybe if Frank is still listening, since he's the only developer on at the moment, maybe he can comment on this.
Yeah, or think about it. He did say he's going to provide us with some comments, written comments, so he's not put on the spot.
I think the rest of us should think about that too.
Right, and Michael, I'll just say that as with the other radio dials, this is a radio dial that you can turn if you like. The first draft that Sharon recommended is that there be no more than 50% of any one building type. You could adjust that. You could say that it could be up to 80% one building type. You could say that if it's smaller than a certain size, that it could be 100% one. We'd probably recommend that once you reach 10 acres and you can put in a fair amount of housing, that it not be entirely one thing.
I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there is an example. It's sort of off the main street at Heatherwood, whatever bird song or whatever. that street is called. There is a small development with, I can't remember how many, but maybe 6 or 7 or 8 duplexes, and it's 100% duplexes, and it looks very nice. I mean, I've had a look at it, and they're on a little circle. I think garages are underneath, if I remember correctly, but they're all duplexes, side by side.
Any other comments or feedback from anyone? Sandy, you had your hand up.
Okay. Hi. I just wanted, I'm just sharing, I spoke with Vince Bolduc on the phone, and he's having technical problems, and he wanted to be able to you know, provide comments and provide input, but it's just not working that way. He can hear everybody, but he can't see any of us, and he can't figure out a way to unmute himself. But you know, he's very interested and he wanted to participate but couldn't.
Sandy, he could certainly call in if he wanted, or we can make sure that he has time on the next agenda to call in if it doesn't work out for tonight.
Could you try unmuting him, Paul? Maybe you could do it. He's under Eleanor.
Yeah, I can only ask him to unmute. I can't physically do it, unfortunately.
I guess that's
So
good point. It'll be invading.
No, the system doesn't let me unmute him. I physically can only ask him.
Yeah, okay. Lonnie?
Yeah, I would like to comment on the building types versus the density or land-based. And I'm not a developer. I do work for UVM, and so I'm in the position of trying to interpret zoning regulations and try and enabling the university to do what it wants to do. It's usually in Burlington. But I do want to say, I think personally, it would be easier for me to understand if I knew what the goals of the Planning Commission were in defining either building type based or density based. Density based is simpler just because it's more understandable, because it's been in existence for much longer. So, and that's the way the regulations are designed right now. So if you change it, my first thought is, oh, well, if you've changed it to land-based, I want to see what I can actually build. Is it the same? Is it less? Is it more than what I have right now? So I don't think I'll be the only person representing a landowner who's going to have those questions. And my real question is, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to get efficient? It sounds like what I've heard from you so far is that you're trying to get efficient, dense building while preserving as much natural resources as possible. If I'm incorrect, please correct me. And then if those are your goals, what's the best way to get there? And I do think if you're also, I think part of the problem is that you want beautiful buildings and not ugly buildings. And so like the 4-story building on Allen Road, or there's plenty of other examples. Maybe you want to talk about design and scale and articulation of the building. You know, the balconies would help with that actually. So you could kind of get accomplish a few goals with that. So those are my comments. Right now, I don't know what the building type based regulations are, so I can't comment about them because they're not there. But my question is, if you want to, maybe you can, if you want to encourage a developer to be creative, you can say that and maybe give them choices rather than prescriptive minimums and maximums. So those are my comments. If that helps, I'm not sure. Thank you.
Monica? Go ahead.
I just did, following up on that, I wanted to say I do think that we're going to have to figure out how to communicate with the public about this, because if it, Paul just made a comment about underlying zoning, which a PUD I think can override, kind of. So if we are moving away from something that feels understandable, and R4 means X, and now we're moving to something different, I hope that we can very, very clearly articulate the goal and also the how it functions. But also, a comment back though too is that one thing that has been frustrating is that, and I think a frustration to the community, is that they think an R4 is an R4, but in fact an R4 has density bonuses on top of it, so the community is surprised when something more than an R4 happens. They expect to just see 4 in an acre. So I think that this actually is a way of being more clear to everybody, but articulating it is going to be, I think, a challenge. We need to give that some space. It took me a long time to understand it. So.
I guess so. What's the path forward? So we're already after 9. I mean, I've heard a lot in support of, you know, just trying to move forward with these recommendations, and then kind of being able to actually see it in some examples, and you know, being able to really try to dial in those individual components. Like once we have something to really dial in. I mean, it's hard when it's just in a table and we don't have a kind of the bigger text and things. So.
Do you need like a straw poll of our support for these recommendations?
Maybe. I mean, is that it does feel like if we're asking Sharon to kind of write up some you know, draft language, then maybe we should get a straw poll and see if we're ready. Michael, are you giving?
Yeah, I was going to ask whether you want written input from us. It's a bit, you know, we've all made comments on various aspects of this one table that we're looking at right now, but I'm not sure that it'll all come together. Taking a straw poll probably wouldn't take into account the opinions of this several of us, you know, all the commissioners.
Okay. I guess I'm not sure what the best way to go forward then. Maybe Bernie?
Well, I was just going to, I think few minutes ago or whatever, Paul was just asking for kind of the 10,000 foot level. And that was, is this overall approach okay? And then I think there was going to be more, if we thought the overall approach was okay, there was going to be more massaging and language on Sharon's part to give us something more detailed to chew on. And I know, you know, Duncan had asked for some specific examples and stuff. So I kind of felt like all Paul was really looking for was, you know, is kind of the 10,000 foot level, is this kind of, are we headed in the right direction? And then if it is, then it'll be fleshed out in greater detail. And, you know, I had said, I thought that at the 10,000 foot level, this looked okay. And, you know, I think along with everybody else, I want to see a little more detail as we go, but I think overall I'm okay with the approach. But that's
I would
me.
agree with what Bernie is saying. I mean, as an overall approach, and Paul has heard some of our comments and can take those into account. And then, as Bernie so aptly put it, massage this a little bit to take those comments and suggestions into account. But yeah, as an overall approach, it's works for me.
Okay. Anyone else? Maybe a thumbs up if you're interested. Got Duncan, Paul.
Thumbs up.
Paul
I do feel
Ingalls.
strongly about the Affordable Housing Committee weighing in because we'll be canceling out the density bonus. So, but I think that can be addressed as long as we give them that chance.
Okay.
Monica, I'll reach out to Sandy and John this week to now that we have sort of the general thumbs up to get them engaged right away on that stuff.
Okay. I know that was a long discussion on this, but I think this is like a big key piece to make sure we understood. Paul, how are you feeling about kind of moving through the rest of the agenda in an abbreviated way?
I feel great about that. I think I can run through the next one very quickly for you if in the next 5 minutes. So just quickly, I mostly just wanted to give you a heads up about the summary and priority of related work. That's my working table of the various different amendments. I'd love to have a conversation with you when you have a few minutes to think about how you would like to digest those. Very clearly the first priority is interim zoning. There are some low-hanging fruit and there's some interesting projects in there. Whether you want to have staff put it to you in writing so that you can think about it, whether you want to have a subgroup, sort of like you did with the Shearer request to get an initial briefing on that, whether you want us to sort of strip aside anything except the absolute most critical and not even touch these for a little while. I don't need an answer tonight. I just wanted you to see what's out there for that one.
So basically the green and the blue ones?
So the sort of brownish ones are the PUD related ones. The green are the standalone projects that don't really relate to anything else. And the blue are city center / form-based code ones. That's how I was trying to categorize them. The green ones that say site plan are sort of connected to one another a little bit, but those are the three kind of groups that I tried to put this into, so it made some sense because it's a long list.
Okay, so maybe we should just generally think about the list, take a look and see if maybe a subgroup or work on pieces of them, or we could hold off. Is that the question?
Yep. Or if you wanted just in writing, and I've got a little summary for pretty much all of these written up as to where they are, what they mean, why they are. If you just wanted that in writing and then you can think about it in your own time, that's fine too. Okay.
Did you have feedback on the approach there?
Just real quick question. It might be good also if any of us looked at this. I know Paul Ingalls is a new member, but just to see if sort of the priorities are right now what we feel are the priorities. There may be a couple of these that some people may want to move up or down. So I would maybe suggest, we let you know, Paul, if we, felt that number 29 should be number 15 or what have you. I know you don't want to go through a whole new process, but just maybe a couple.
No, certainly. And broadly speaking, I categorize them as PUD, things that are directly related to interim zoning first, along with the Shearer one. And then other things were sort of dependent on either how simple it was from staff's perspective or how much of a burning issue that maybe the DRB had been flagging for us for a while. So I'm happy to take any feedback on any of this.
Thanks.
Can I just raise a flag that as I went through the mapping and when we're at a point of doing that together, I do think that as a commission, if we start talking about the official map, which is on that list under a different, if we start talking about what we're doing now, there may be an interest in looking at other parts of the city and how they're currently zoned. just saying, if we're in this interim zoning and we're doing all this work, there may be some pockets here and there that we may need to relook at, and I'm not sure where that falls in to that map.
Okay, planning grant, Paul?
I spoke with
question.
Jessica earlier. Oh yes, go ahead, Michael.
Do you want written responses to what you set out in your August 25th memorandum to the commission?
I'm happy to take any feedback that you would like to give on that. My plan was to roll out those elements in the next couple of meetings, more specifically as we just did with the density one tonight. So if you've got any thoughts in advance, I'd more than happily take them, but I was gonna focus more attention to those subjects over the next couple meetings. So on the municipal planning grant, after reviewing with staff and speaking with Jessica, there's enough on your plates that we didn't need to be chasing a grant that has some very specific criteria of what the state's looking for this year that just didn't quite align with the projects that you've got. So I put this on the agenda a week ago to hold the place in case there was one, but our recommendation is not to apply for one this year. It's going to be extremely competitive, and it just didn't align with your key projects. Next item was for the naming of the road that is the quote-unquote clubhouse parcel directly across from the golf course clubhouse. They have requested, the applicant has requested Clubhouse Drive, I believe, was their number one. That's their request. Staff recommends their second option would be a little less confusing to people because the clubhouse is actually on the other side of the street. But
I move to accept the Medalist Drive as the choice.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, any discussion, or did you get any comment from the applicant, Paul? Were they okay with that? I know.
These were their two that they submitted. Their preference was clubhouse, but both of them were the options that they gave forward.
Okay, any other discussion?
Just tell them, Paul, if they don't like it, we're going to go with Divot Lane.
Oh, Bernie.
Everyone, Bernie.
Okay, so all in favor, say aye or thumbs up so we can see.
Aye.
Okay.
Medalist Drive.
Aye.
Paul,
Medalist.
I got, that looked like everyone, but I'm gonna ask any nays. Okay, I thought I'd gotten everyone. Great.
Clarification.
Medalist
Is it Medalist Drive or Medalist Loop?
Drive was the motion.
Drive.
Okay, we also have some minutes. Any discussion on minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes of August 25th, 2020.
Second.
Hang on, sorry, I couldn't find my button. I shared a comment with Paul earlier. I don't know, Paul, if it was concise enough to add. I think the package didn't change, but I made a comment.
Was this the one that you asked about it on Monday?
Yeah, the 1.2. The minutes are extremely brief in what I said, but I made a bigger point about us needing to understand the math behind the 1.2 for the SEQ, and is it a goal or is it a maximum? And I really feel strongly that we need to understand and address that, and that just wasn't clear in those minutes. It just said I mentioned.
Would you like to hold the minutes for the next one? I also got some feedback from Sandy Dooley about a sentence that didn't make any sense. So if you'd like, I can put those two edits into your next packet.
I would appreciate it.
If you'd like, and then you can just do that then.
Yep,
Thank
that's
you.
fine.
That's fine. Yeah.
Michael?
Yep. That's okay.
Okay, let's do that then. So that means we are, any other business?
Just
Okay.
one quick note that I made note of Burlington's public hearing. They did not get the hearing notice in the newspaper, so they're going to rewarn that hearing for a future date.
Great. Okay, thank you all so much. I'm sorry we went late, but I think it was a really great discussion. So thank you very much.
And I'm happy to do more mapping sessions if anybody wants.
Yes.
Thank you, Monica.
Bye.
Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, we are adjourned.
Thank
you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.